Hello, good morning. I'd like to welcome my panel up. I'm Maria Ingold. I'm a strategy and innovation CTO in media and AI. And I have some great people here across healthcare and government. Yeah, that's perfect. And we're going to talk, and they're going to do a little bit of an introduction about themselves, so you have some context for what we're going to speak about. Shika?
Okay then. So hi, good morning. I'm Shika Hornsey. I'm an American, and I've moved over to the UK probably 3 years ago. So I grew up mainly doing in technology, doing roles in the US. I was a CIO in financial services. That's my background mainly. When I arrived, we were going into COVID, and I thought, somewhat altruistically, I wanted to give back from my adopted country and do something to help. So I started working for the government. And it's been a fascinating experience, especially as far as customer journeys are concerned. Because you probably already know this, but it dawned on me while I was in the inside of the government that we treat customers differently in the way we define customers, and their journeys are extraordinarily different in the private sector and within the government as well. But I'll talk more about that as we progress.
That's great. Douglas?
Thank you. Good morning to you all. My name is Douglas Hamidisha. I don't know what I'm echoing. Must be the alcohol-induced from yesterday. I'm Chief Clinical Information Officer, also a creative futurist. That basically means I'm always thinking about future tech and how we can bring that to bear in any environment that I'm in. I'm also a nurse by background, so I've headed up National Programme for IT, the London-based division. So I was part of the team that brought in digitization to the clinical workforce and all the challenges that came about from that, so the fallout of that, and I support the Royal College of Nurses in making sure that our clinical workforce, which is the Royal College of Nurses, is the highest grossing in terms of figures, membership in the whole of Europe for any single profession. Making sure that nurses at the front line of delivering care have the right access to tools and know why they're using it, and they can, as we're going to discuss later on, trust the data.
Oh, Douglas, your mic is down there, mate.
There you go. You got it?
That's why.
Sam?
At least we solved it.
Good morning, everyone. Sam Licio. I'm a Brit who went to Canada and then came back again. So I have a Northern Irish and Canadian accent. So when you're trying to decipher that, you'll know what that is. After a couple of decades in Canada in government and healthcare at the CIO level, back to England during COVID with the National Institute for Health and Care Research. So you take all the acronyms of a CIO world, take all the acronyms from healthcare, and then throw in academia and research. That's what we're dealing with. So happy to have a great discussion today.
Wonderful. So we're talking about human-centric. What does that approach to innovation mean to all of you? Shika, do you want to start with that?
Yes, I will. So I've already mentioned the fact that the concept of customers, and every industry has a different concept. But interestingly enough, in government, every citizen is a customer. But the rules of engagement are slightly different in that citizens have to engage with their government. They don't have a choice. In the retail or in every other outside private industry, usually the enterprise courts their customers. You have to give them a positive experience to get them in, to actually want them to engage with you. While that's the ideal in government, I'm not saying that we beat them off with a stick, that's not it. That's a good to have in government, and those mandated services, for example, healthcare, and I'm sure my other panelists will actually mention that, but from a government perspective, we try our best to make the customer journey positive. But we have to do it within the context of regulations. And what the government mandates is that regulations actually, they don't necessarily constrict us, but I think one of Sam put it best when we were discussing this before, where government is mandated to follow regulations within a context of we are told what we cannot do. So our interaction with our customers and citizens is substantially different than it is in private enterprise. And so we do our best to come up with an accessible for all journey. It doesn't always have to be pleasant though. And that's what we're struggling with internally, to make sure that we follow industry rules as much as possible. So we start courting our customers, which is an unusual concept within the government itself. We're still trying, and we're far behind industry, but that's one of the reasons we're behind, because the rules and the legislation that that we have actually constrict what we actually can do, which is not true for private industry. So yeah, I think I'll hand off to my colleagues.
Yeah, and Douglas, you've got sort of a dual background in both healthcare and media. So what's your perspective on the human-centric aspect of this?
It's a very interesting one. It's a conflicting one. If we just reflect back on the last couple of years as a collective, we can all say we are expert health consumers. COVID has made us more sensitive to health data. And what does that mean for a service that was commissioned, brought about for sickness? We've got a sick care model, but now we're vested in our own data, and we've got access to it. Most of us have information on our risks that is FDA accredited. What does that mean when you then go to your GP, and then GP says, oh, you've got raised blood pressure, but the GP is taking that point in time data, and you've got contextual data because it's been monitoring you throughout the day. If I go and see my GP, I'm nervous. At 50, I'm terrified. And so, and I've got a predisposition to high blood pressure, diabetes, I fit all the profiles. But then how can we get that data into the central system? So from a health perspective, we're in a very confusing place, as well as training and finding relevance. How can we support the expert health consumer, the customer, whichever way, service user, whichever way they want it to be defined now? And then also as a profession, how does the profession support that in around legislation and frameworks to keep that going? From a media perspective, it's much more fluid, and I like it in the sense that there's more liberation. You know, when you've got generative AI, there's nothing stopping anybody getting access to it. You know, when you buy your iPhone, nothing's stopping you buying it, you know. But when you access health services, you got to comply, you got to meet certain criteria. You cannot just rock up anywhere and expect a particular service. I know it's free at the point of care, but try going to an A&E department for howling toothache. You have to go private, you know? So these differences, these variances are unique, but I think the healthcare services ultimately can learn a lot from how media is approaching addressing people's core needs. Because that's what this is about. It's people's fundamental core needs, wants, and the private sector do it fantastically well, retail do it fantastically well, aviation do it fantastically well, but healthcare, you could be sick enough to come in. Yeah? If you've got a slight cough, where are you going? There's a part of you that says go A&E, right? And the part of you say, no, but they don't want us, I'm contributing to the chaos. So where do you go? So that therein lies the challenge.
Yeah, and Sam, you're in healthcare research, so how does this fit into you?
Well, I think it goes back to some of what Douglas is saying. It's all about that establishment of trust. Fundamentally, the business that the National Institute for Healthcare Research does is try and match people who could be potential participants in research to those research studies to be able to find those next therapeutics or those next treatments. And that's part of the reason that during COVID, we were able to get the AstraZeneca vaccine into people's arms in just over a year. We couldn't have done that prior to that, but it's the establishment of those trust-based relationships with people. And patients don't like to be called customers. So it's how do you establish that level of trust with someone to say, trust us, trust the whole healthcare system, the health and care research system, to use your data in a way that's going to help with the provision of your care, but also the provision of care for the entire population. And that's a real leap for a lot of people. And how do you make sure that you're demonstrating that you can treat that data in a way that maintains that privacy and security? So it's really difficult when you're taking that from a consumer model where there's always a quid pro quo. I'm going to exchange my data because you're going to give me some fancy software or an app that I can put on my phone. And we do that kind of accept transaction every day, thinking about it in terms of I'm giving and I'm getting. When we engage with government, we engage with healthcare, that's a little bit different. There's a trust-based relationship that we need to establish there. And I think when we think about user-centered design in health or in research, it's how do we maintain and establish that basis of trust and use technology to be able to reinforce that rather than degrade that or take away from that. So it's being human-centered and using technology to wrap around and enable that and recognize that all is predicated on establishment of trust.
Yeah, we're going to come back more to the security and trust, but first, before we do that, I'd like to talk about user and behavior analytics. So what role does that play when you're designing a people-centric approach to your business strategy? Sam, do you want to pick that one up from there?
And to pick up a little bit of what Shika was talking about, when people engage with government or healthcare, it's a very different relationship than when you engage with a commercial entity. And the behaviors change a little bit. The behavioral analytics are a little bit different in that. Because you're expecting within the NHS that you get services and you don't have to be thinking about, should I go to A&E for this particular circumstance? And because there's a big wait time there, how do I pick which hospital, which A&E I go to? You're presented with all of those different options, and technology can certainly help with that, but your behavior changes in relation to that as well. So whereby I think in commercial enterprise it's a lot easier to ask your customers what they want and to use your service design based on that ethnographic research and that understanding of that service design based on what humans would like to see. It's much more difficult for government or healthcare to do that because typically what people want to see is not what they get. And then you've got to work through all of that to get to those trust relationships that I talked about. So behavioral analytics for consumers of health care and government services, it's very different. That whole share my data, make my data available, know your customer isn't quite as easy, as simple, as straightforward as it is in the commercial sphere. So it's challenging. You've got to interpret those behavioral analytics a little bit differently because people engage with government and health differently than they do with commercial enterprise.
Yeah, speaking of that, Shika, how are they engaging and how does that affect that?
So it's interesting because in commercial enterprises, for example, I've seen customers or individuals give up their data freely. To your point, it's because they're getting something back. That same data they will not give to the government because that's when the suspicions come up. It's like, well, why do you want this? So, well, so I can track your journey, so I can make your journey easier? No. I mean, there must be another potentially nefarious reasons. And honestly, I look at it with two different hats on. In my personal space, basically, I react the same way as a customer, as a user. But with my CDIO hat on, when I'm designing systems, or I look at it and think, there is an element of truth in why this is, I won't say suspicion, but why that lack of trust is there, in that at the end of the day, the government, the healthcare systems, we're designing for Joe or Jill citizen. However, that citizen is not an individual. It's an amalgamation of a citizen, and it's where the needs of the many will always trump the needs of the few. Because that's our job, to keep the many safe. Ideally to keep all safe, but if we have to choose, it's always the many. And I think that's where the trust piece comes from. But it's still, from a design perspective, we still have to service the needs of the many. And that also has accessibility connotations and stuff because for a commercial enterprise, I think you've got a lot more wiggle room. Within the government, you really don't. You have to make sure that the bulk of your citizens are cared for. Ideally, all of them, but absolutely the bulk, because you're trying to keep people safe. You're trying to make sure that they can actually pay their taxes. They can actually do the things that they have to keep the country running. So the drivers are slightly different as well at the enterprise level, which leads into the regulations and also leads into the user journeys and how we design.
Well, I like how you slipped in a Star Trek reference, right? You know, Spock. Anyway. Douglas, what are your thoughts on this?
If I was to say or ask you, what comes to mind now, your expert health consumers, when I say Cambridge Analytica? You know, we talk about trust.
Yeah.
Then what happens when we enter a pandemic and the government needs a lot of data to model to build vaccines? When now the population, the group here, are like, you know, the trust is gone. It takes a lot of effort to rebuild trust. If we're talking about behavior, that's why I like retail. Imagine your journey through Tesco's on a Sunday morning. You're hungry, you just walk the dog. You walk in, 10 o'clock, so you know the tills are open, right? You get the smell of what? Yeah? Then the bread and all of that kind of stuff. You start getting hungry, yeah? Then you end up buying a lot of things that you didn't intend to buy, yeah? And sometimes forgetting totally why you were there for. Because the behavior has been analyzed to such a T within retail, they can do those things. If you translate that to your experience, walking to a hospital that's foreign to you, looking for somebody for directions, looking for that string on the floor, like as if you're chasing a minotaur, yeah? Just to get to the right department. Because the behavior has not been analyzed enough. Because people, when they present in a hospital, are not of the same mindset as, say, the developers, the programmers, the people who build these buildings, who design things in a very clean, sterile environment. Now, if you design things based upon the behavior of people that are chaotic, that are maybe dragging somebody in with them that's in pain, how do they operate? How do they think? Where do they go to? A lot of hospitals are still not being built that way, and that even permeates into strategies in terms of how then do we deliver care. It needs to be behavioral focused, like at the front end. How do we access services? Is it via app? If so, what type of app? How do we navigate those apps? Who wants to see the GP? Who's of the generation that they're looking for a matron? You know, they brought back the matron like 10, 15 years ago for a generation that said, when the matron was there in the good old days, we had a matron, not the carry on laughing days, in the good old days, we had a matron. And the matron made sure the hospital was clean, and she commanded everybody, she shouted everybody. In other words, she was a bully, yeah? So that generation with a newer generation that want light touch, my children, when I engage with them, I talk to them, they text me back. They're upstairs, I'm shouting, they text me back. Because I need to meet them on the medium that they want to connect and engage with. So when we talk about strategies and behavior, we've got to be able to be flexible and flex. The customer is always right, client's always right, and it's a transient thing. Like right now when you're in this room, you're not a patient, but you walk into a hospital receiving care, you're a patient. You're back in the community receiving care, you're not a patient. You're a service user or you're something. So as data moves between different states, it has different levels of trust, different levels of responsibility, accountability, and authority. It's understanding that. And the best way I can do it very quickly, I'm now excessive time. Anyone here that's had a child in the UK? Can you show of hands very quickly? Had a child, okay. Anyone here had the child inside their own belly? Thank you, men put their hands down, fantastic. Right, I was trying to be inclusive there, yeah. But this is important. If you remember your experience, did you have access to your medical record? Were you entrusted with your data in a file as a mother, expectant mother? Or was everything stored on the GP system? A GP system? GP system? We've still got 80%, so you're probably in an exemplar environment. We've still got 80% of pregnant women that have their medical files. And they're the only group that still have their paper files with them. And so if you were to ask those mothers, expectant mothers, would you want somebody to take that physical data and use it for whatever reason, research, whatever, they'll make an informed decision. But because there are degrees of separation between our data now, we don't know what that feels like. There's no loss. until we educate the masses, the population, on what we mean by data in all its guises, I think then we can have a more measured approach, really.
Absolutely. This is so different from media, where, say, Netflix is analyzing user behavior so it can bring you back, more things like Squid Game or more things like Wednesday. Clearly I have things I like watching on there. And people are very happy to trade that data for more things that they like. It's very different. So just on what you were talking about, Douglas, I'm going to ask you to elaborate a bit, because that extends to privacy, right? So, both for the employee, both for the customer, and then how are you balancing all of the security around that, maintaining the user privacy, maintaining a positive user experience, all of these pieces?
It is highly complicated. And health, if you look at mental health as an example, if you were to see a psychiatrist or psychologist for a session within a hospital, that session is normally private. Mm-hmm. Some art therapists, their sessions are private. So whatever the person draws in that session is only known to the therapist. There were instances where a patient will draw something that the art therapist knows what that means. Will not share it with the clinical staff. And then that patient would then go into the community and commit a heinous crime. Someone gets stabbed or even killed. Mm. So there's data and information has to flow in such a way that not only protects the individual, but also protects the clinical staff that are having to give the care. So that is a complete challenge when we say, okay, let's have a collaborative experience. I'm a professional based upon academia, yeah? The patient is an expert based upon lived experience, right? So together, that combination should yield, if you do your Venn diagrams, the sweet spot. But unfortunately, we've not reached that sweet spot in recognizing lived experience matches academia. And so with all that data being sometimes protected, sometimes there's authorship is in the wrong direction, sometimes ownership is. If I was to ask you very quickly, who owns your health data? Is it the GP or yourself? Show of hands.
For which one?
Show of hands for GP. Hands up for GP. Owns your data. Okay. So the majority of people think they own their data. Okay. So where's your data then, if you own it? Come on. Yeah? It's yours, right? The majority of people think they own their data, but they don't even know where it is. Where is it?
Is there not a difference between storage and ownership?
Again, it's transit. Whilst it's on your wrist being tracked on your iWatch or something like that, you might say, I know where it is, it's here. Okay, where's the servers for that data? Yeah? And when the servers are syncing to other servers, is it in the UK even?
That's where the trust comes in.
That's when the trust comes back in. You see, so the whole notion of what we're talking about, trust of data when it's transient, and there's a lot more deeper humanistic conversations that need to be had, that it's not technology based. We talk about humanistic adoption of technology at its core. These are conversations that we need to agree as a society, ethically, in terms of trust and all of that kind of stuff as well.
Sam?
Yeah, just to reflect on that in terms of for the good of the individual. So I think when we think about health data and who owns it, we think very much personally about our own data. I'm a 50-something-year-old woman, reasonably fit. What's in my record? There's probably not a lot of stuff in there, my vaccine history maybe. But I think about that in a very possessive way. If we think broader in terms of population health, it's really important to understand that there were certain cohorts of the population that were disproportionately affected by COVID. And we didn't know that until the pandemic hit. But if we shared that health information at that aggregated or population level, we might have been able to establish earlier protocols of treatment that could have been able to target those cohorts that were disproportionately affected. And it wasn't just elderly people, it wasn't just people in care homes. Ethnic minorities were impacted to much greater extent by COVID than others. And we didn't understand that throughout the progression of the pandemic. But had we had access to population level health data, we might have been able to make some of those predictions ahead of time and been able to treat that way. So some of the key ways that research is now using data is at that population level and looking at areas of underserved and matching research against where those populations exist. Alcoholic liver disease is prevalent in Blackpool, but most of the research that's done into alcoholic liver disease is done out of Imperial College in London. Why on earth would you do all of the research in London and require people to be traveling back and forward across the country to do that? Why not have that research centered where those diseases are most prevalent? So at that population level, it's thinking about sharing health data in that aggregated and anonymized way that can help identify what those treatments and therapeutics for the future might look like. And when we think about trusting our health data, it's not just about for the provision of our own care, it's how we represent that broader benefit for society. I think that's a really important consideration because we always think about what's in it for me, what's in it for my care, how am I going to be treated better. But if my data is available in that aggregated way, and now technology allows us to be able to store and process and manage that in secure and private, by secure and private means, we have the ability to do that where we perhaps didn't do that before. And certainly when we didn't, when we have the stacks of paper that people have to carry around with them. So I think that's an important consideration. We always think about what's in it for me rather than what's in it for the broader good.
Yeah, Shika, on privacy and security and the user experience, and how is that in government?
So in government, within human-centric design, there are so many competing factors. We've already established it, that there are various levels. There's also not just the needs of the consumer or the customer, the patient, the citizen. There's also the needs of the enterprise. And as I've mentioned before, the needs of the many in government will trump the needs of the few. But from a government perspective, our job is to make sure our citizens are safe. So from a security angle, and safe not just in the normal scheme of things like cybersecurity, etc. It's also other, political entities and stuff. So from a security angle, we try and keep our packages, our applications, everything as safe as possible, which means it adds another layer of complexity to the interaction where a lot of the apps are kludgy to use. However, kludgy, sorry, American word, is as in it's a lot less intuitive than you'd expect. However, the government is trying to help in that, and I've seen a great deal of mobile apps lately that have come across from HMRC, for example, which are very intuitive. I would put them more in the retail space because they're being used or being designed by retail rules rather than normal government rules. And so there's competing levels of requirements as to what we do for security and what we do to keep things safe. For example, from a central government perspective, all the applications are usually a lot more difficult to use because the drivers for central government are a little different. And when I'm saying central government, I mean Cabinet Office, for example, right? So government to government interactions, our customers are other government entities. So therefore, those are a lot more, not difficult, but you have to go through many more gates to get to the security levels. However, for citizens, from a government perspective, we're trying to actually make the interactions a lot more retail type, so that, and just out of a show of hands, do you guys see that too? I mean, I've got the brilliant opportunity to get some real life customer feedback. Have any of you used any of the recent like the HMRC apps? I'm not talking so good, bad, and different. Was it a positive experience? Show of hands. Good. Whew, okay. Because that's the data that's coming back, and so we do feedback and user studies and stuff. But as I said, there's a level of, I'll call it suspicion, but not as much trust within users as you'd kind of expect. So the data that we get back is potentially questionable as well. But the government is actively trying to engage with citizens to make sure that they can actually use their digital products as effectively and easily as possible. Of course, because it's nationwide, it's usually the most vulnerable that are the most affected if we don't do our job right. And so there's targets for accessibility, and I know we're going to get to that at some point, but so I won't jump the gun. But basically, it's a very complex, thorny problem, which we're trying really hard to solve. It's really good to see that it's been reasonably positive. But from a security perspective, there's so many levels of security that we have to go through to make sure that the nation is kept safe as a first mandate, and then the individuals are, and then of course the data is. But I'm sure you guys will talk about it more. Oh, while I have the mic, one other comment that I was going to say is, we've touched on it briefly, from a human-centric design perspective, it's also the drivers of the customer of when they interact with applications, as well as what space they're interacting with. For example, if you're doing it as a retail customer, Netflix, for example, you're usually relaxed, or if you're stressed, you're looking forward to actually engaging, and you want to engage with a digital app. In government and healthcare, the drivers for the consumers are usually not positive. They're under stress. They're doing it because they have to, and so the behavior patterns change. So that's one thing we've touched on briefly, but that from a human-centric design perspective, you have to keep that in center of mind to make it ideally as easy as possible for them to actually get to you and get the outcome that they want to, and from a government perspective, you need them to get. Anyway, I'll be quiet now.
I will say that the HMRC chat has transformed my life from having to not make phone calls, but to chat with someone. Excellent. So, Shika, I'm going to ask you more, and this now on AI, right?
Okay.
So, obviously, we're seeing a lot more impacts from generative AI, and that includes ethics, it includes bias, it includes regulations. How is that impacting?
So, I've touched on the fact that regulations affect government entities differently than it does, say, the private sector, where regulations will define what government entities cannot do. So we have, basically think of it as a straitjacket, right? So we are firmly told what lines we can't cross, what we cannot do, and and I do think of this a lot of times, because so financial services, basically, you court the customers, you give them what they need to make sure, from a banking perspective, that they use your bank rather than your competitors. So you know how to draw them in, you can give them discounts, you can give them offers, etc. Can't do any of that in the government. So the flip side is true, and I do think that I function within a straitjacket, and the rules are very different. So I'm told what I can't do, and I have to make sure that I live within those boundaries. From an AI perspective, though, I think it's a really good, not necessarily safe, but it's a really good use, especially from a generative AI perspective, to be able to use it in things like chat, to be able to understand how we can interact with our citizens, to get more from them, to get them to trust us a bit more. I'm saying not necessarily safe because of the fact that the flip side of it is also true, because I'm sure, we're seeing a lot more cybersecurity issues with generative AI because it mimics humans, or can. And so from a government perspective, the access to data, etc., we have to guard people's data a lot more stringently now because of the uptick in AI-based cybersecurity, phishing, or whatever exercises that's going on. So it's a really, potentially, it's a phenomenal place to be, and I see the usage for it to be fantastic. For example, I have to have websites in English and in Welsh. So that's one fantastic use case for generative AI for me, where I can actually translate my website into a different language, as long as the syntax is correct, and it's not yet. But my dream is, you mentioned Star Trek before, is to do that universal translator speak, where I push a button and websites become translated into other languages universally. It doesn't have to just be within this government. It can be global. I mean, the power and potential of AI is astronomical, but that's the positive use cases that I can think of. So I'm kind of waiting to make my job a lot easier within that straitjacket. But anyway.
So Douglas, are you in a straitjacket too, or is it a little bit different for you?
Yeah, I'm in the straitjacket, most definitely. But I'm positive. I'm trying to do my Houdini and escape. But not underwater, not submerged. No.
Not upside down as well,
Yeah,
right?
not upside down, no.
Okay.
And not suspended either,
Yeah.
from a high height. But what I will say is this. If you take a look at, say, digital notation, all clinicians have to write notes about their patients all the time. And there's a big argument being had right now at the Royal College of Nurses. Should we allow clinical workforce to use generative AI to help compose complex notes and insert that into the patient's record? So it's happening anyway. So we're talking at a strategic level, high level. Nurses on the front line who are creative, looking for any tool to help them manage their caseload. So my question to you as an audience, if you got access to your medical records, if you read them and you realize it's all AI generated, how would you feel? How would you feel? Just think about it. Don't just think about where this is going.
Would they be in Welsh?
In Welsh, yeah, even Polish, yeah, Mandarin and all sorts. But it's a very unique place to be in, because to introduce AI, I remember when I was training in 2003 and I qualified 2006, the first thing I realized is my 3 years of training, I wasn't trained in office management, yeah, paper record keeping. I wasn't trained in that. In fact, no GP is, no social worker is, no nurse is. There's no such module on paper record keeping. But what happens pre-digital, patients' records went missing all the time. Guess what? Because we weren't trained to file. We don't know how to file. So there's something about educating the educators first at university level to teach the future generation of clinicians, care workers, what AI means and the implications of it, and how to then change your job then title with the unions. Because now, if I'm going to be using such a tool, my job now is more of a judge. I've got to judge the data, I've got to give it authority, and also take clinical ownership of what that AI has done, then put my name on it. This is something that's not being taught anywhere.
Well, what about the positive aspects of it, so that you can now replicate someone's voice who may have lost their voice, and then their loved ones can still continue to hear their voice?
Yeah. There's so many positives.
Yeah.
Like, for example, we triage in North East London. When you contact that department in crisis, it's got an AI assistant co-pilot that you type in, it's like a chatbot, and then it will put you in the right department without you having to do option, like say option 1, and you remember it, then option 2, it does it all for you. So that there's most definitely that. And also there's a gamification aspect to the way some future gazing trusts are working with younger people particularly. How can you get people more invested in their own healthcare and create gaming modules that even if they cheat, I'm from the 80s, if I could crack the code left, right, up, down, and all that kind of stuff, I would cheat. But even cheating still gives me a positive health outcome. That is where we are now looking at the positive application of AI models, but looking at the behavior, looking at what people want, looking at what they need, and where they can get access to services, so we can give back choice. Because I think I'm in a straitjacket as a clinician, but outside of those parameters, the client, the service user, has free reign to do what they like, And we're moving to a time whereby, as AI is being injected into everything from your washing machine to your tablets, to everything. Do we need a healthcare service? What would happen if your local hospital was no longer there? You know, what would you do? You'd be thinking about preventative healthcare, which is what we're supposed to be doing. You know, light touch NHS. You know, your home is supposed to be your hospital. Your car is supposed to be your ambulance. You're supposed to be able to monitor yourself with your devices on your own body and then make useful insights from that. So you go to the hospital for emergency services. But because we've got these competing arenas all the time, that we are still yet to reap the full benefits for it. So there are pockets of it that we have to be positive about, most definitely.
Yeah.
But without supporting clinical staff to make best use of it, we will not reach its full potential.
Yeah, I agreed. Yeah. So Sam, and we've got 5 minutes left, so I've got one more question after this.
So I think getting to that, get clinical staff doing what they're good at, the empathetic social engagement with people, and use AI for what it's good at, which is pattern recognition, data analysis. If you go to your GP now, I know in Canada, they schedule in 7-minute increments. So it's all about getting people in and out in 7 minutes. You get in there with your GP, you're trying to have a conversation, what are they doing? They're looking at their screen, they're checking your information. They're trying to do data analysis versus that engagement with you as a human. So if we can point AI to that analysis of large data sets, pattern recognition, to then give that to clinical professions to say, here's Sam coming in, you need to know this about her, have this conversation today, and enable them to have that conversation without having to worry about, where do I find that file? Where does that file go after I've written some notation on there? How do I translate that notation into some codes? And get people doing what people are good at, and get technology doing the things that people aren't good at, that across the NHS is 90% of what they have to do today, and that's why we have the capacity and capability issues that we do. So it's a huge opportunity, I think, when we think about AI, not necessarily to be thinking about, you know, the self-driving car and the insulin pump that automatically detects what your levels are, and those are all great things. We can get rid of that administration burden, and we can have AI that does that now. RPA's been doing that for years, and apply that in the right place. That's, I think, where the tremendous opportunity is.
Yeah, so extending from that, you know, and utilizing technology or other methods, what are we doing around accessibility, right? Because that's another key piece. Sam? Yeah,
and I think some of the things that we've put in place as technologists are not as accessible as we would like.
Yeah.
I use the example, there's a website called Join Dementia Research that enables people to register to be part of dementia research if they've had a recent dementia diagnosis or they're a carer of someone with dementia. You can imagine what that registration process looks like when you have to create a complex password, or your password expires, or you're getting a code through multi-factor authentication. You can't do that with dementia patients. So we have to rethink what our security provisions look like in an accessible world. And when we think about neurodiversity, all of those different ways by which means that we can secure and make things private aren't accessible. So we need to rethink those from the bottom up, from a user-centered approach. So it's really food for thought, I think, in terms of how do we make those provisions that we've put in place over the last 10 years or so more accessible, but still secure and not liable to be hacked. So maybe we use AI to come up with what those measures and means might be, recognizing that the hackers are going to have the AI hacking on the AI.
Right, Douglas?
Yeah, interesting topic. If you look at the southeast of England, which is the gateway to the world, really, the Vikings knew that. So
I'm a Viking descendant, by the way. Hi.
Fantastic.
In gold.
Fantastic. So what we have there is, you see the boat crossings. You see a lot of migrants coming in from Faversham, Thanet, Margate. So if you look at the health service in those areas, they're dealing with complexities in terms of health, social deprivation, no money. So the key determinant that we're looking at here is access to technology. Because if you don't have access to a laptop, mobile phone, all this AI gibberish, what does it mean to anybody?
Yeah.
So at governmental level, there has to be a program to support leveling up so everybody has access to a minimum technical requirement to access these sort of tools so that everyone can, reap the benefits. And then what we do locally is engage communities, like people that do social prescribing, religious organizations, voluntary organizations, local influencers, and get them up to speed in understanding the power of AI so that they can go in the communities and evangelize it. So that this is something that you don't want everyone, you want to get everyone on the train and on that journey with you. So it's a lot of outreach. So I find my job now is more as an advocate, it's more like as a teacher than as somebody that tells you a diagnosis, which is a fantastic place to be in. It's like the morphing into something else, because the need for people to need me in a particular capacity as, say, a nurse is no longer there. They want me to signpost. They want me to give them the tools to live as independently as possible. And that is where I am right now. In 30 seconds, if we do some very quick maths, if you are receiving care, for say, as somebody going through depression, anxiety, anything like that, and you're seeing a community mental health nurse for 30 minutes, it's typically the size of an appointment at home, yeah, once a week, yeah? That equates to how many hours per month? Can we do the maths? We're all geeks here. 2 hours, yeah? Yeah? So how many weeks are there in a year? 32. Okay, or you could go 2 times 12, yeah, of a year. How much is that? 24. Come on, the alcohol. Come on, you can be faster. Yeah, 24. That's 1 day. That's all you get in terms of input from a clinician. If you've got anxiety, depression, 1 day across the whole year. So what do you think you're doing with the rest of the time? Yeah, you're self-managing to greater or less degree. Yeah, so how can we give you the tools to help you do that? And this is where I see AI as being able to fill in that gap that we cannot offer you from a health perspective.
That's a great point on access. All right, Shika, it's up to you.
Say, as a robot friend, for example.
Yeah. All right.
Forget the imaginary friends, you've got robot friends. All right, that works. From an accessibility perspective, it's usually, I agree with everything you've said. The issue I have, though, is the fact that that assumes that we have, or the vulnerable amongst us has access to the internet, to technology, etc. And from a government perspective, that's not always the case. So there will always be a segment of the population that is not going to be supported correctly. And that's what the government always tries to target and tries to ensure that their lives are better, that they can actually be included within the bell curve of what is considered average and normal. I don't like using the word normal because it's got negative connotations that if you're not, that if you don't fall within it, there's something wrong with you. I'm using it completely in this safe space. I'm using it as a geek would. Normal distribution curves about 80% of the population kind of thing. So from an accessibility perspective, that's a nut that we're always trying to crack. The most vulnerable of our citizens are entitled to the same scope and care that everybody else is, and that's what we try and go for, which makes it difficult because a lot of times they're not digital. So what do you do? And so that's where the human interactions come in. And I know I'm probably in the minority in this, where we live in a fantastic age where most of us are technically literate. Now we're getting into that aspect of evolution where we have to become data literate, given what's going on with generative AI, and I think it's vastly positive. I don't think it will take away most jobs. I think it will augment most jobs. And I think we've got the ability to, and that will help with accessibility as well, because it can free up, using AI correctly, hopefully it'll be able to free up people to help the vulnerable. And that's kind of how we're approaching it, where it's actually a positive, where if we can get rid of the stuff that we can give machines, for example, the note-taking, obviously, with some human interaction and oversight, because AI still at this point tends to hallucinate a bit. But with that kind of overseership at the human level of AI and new diagnostic tools, etc., if we can use our data correctly and carry it forward, it will free up people's time. And that's a time that we can use for more human-to-human interactions to actually get to the point where, you know, we're living in a fantastic new world where the world is our oyster. We've got so many possibilities, and Star Trek is kind of, and I'm sorry, I grew up on Star Trek. It's one of the cornerstones of my existence, and I think I would love to be able to, you know, go into a world where we actually use the tools that our intellect gave us. And it's a fantastic opportunity, I think. It's also slightly scary, but as long as we use it responsibly from a data and a technology perspective, we might be able to tackle the accessibility issues for our most vulnerable citizens as well, and, you know, actually make mankind a better unit and a better species where we actually take care of and solve all the issues that are riddling us at the moment. Because, for example, with AI, we've used the we're developing medicines much faster. You know, the processing time to develop new vaccines has gone down. The ability to come up with new medicines has magnified. So I'm hoping that as a species, we actually carry the positives forward with an eye on the negatives, and make sure we manage that correctly. But it's, you know, Star Trek is getting to be within our reach.
I love that. I love that. So I'm looking forward to a Star Trek future. I'm also a Trekkie, so I think that's wonderful, and I'd like all of you to thank our panel, Shika, Douglas, and Sam.